When we look at Genesis 1, we see this beautiful picture of who God is and how God creates this world. What I want to do is I want to look at Genesis 1 in the context of the other ancient Near Eastern religious accounts of the creation of the world, particularly the Babylonian account that's called the Enuma Elish. These ideas are drawn from Lisa Sharon Harper's book, The Very Good Gospel, in which she describes Genesis 1 and compares it to the Enuma Elish and draws out, I think, really important differences between these two religious accounts. And I think it drives home this beautiful picture of who we say who God is, and what this world is like, and eventually what we are and how we are called to live into this world as well. So she describes the Babylonian creation account, again, which is called the Enuma Elish, and you can look it up and find it online if you'd like. But in it, it describes this. It tells of how the mighty god Marduk rose up and killed the goddess Tiamat. And then in this graphic and violent picture, he splits her into two. And he takes her ribs of the slain Tiamat, and her ribs become the dome of the sky and the soil of the ground. And so her body ripped apart. One part becomes the sky, and another part becomes the soil. And then he gouges out her eyes, and her eyes become now the source, the fount of the two major rivers in the ancient Near East, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And then Marduk takes the blood of the god Kingu, and he mixes that up with the soil, and out of the blood and soil, he creates humanity. So this is how the ancient Babylonians would have described the creation of the world. This is how they made sense of the world in which they lived. They looked up at the sky, looked up at the ground, they looked at each other as humans and say, where did we come from? How did this place come to be? How did humans come to be in existence? And what's our role? And so the creation account that they told themselves was one of deep violence, battling gods, and destruction. And out of that destruction comes this world. And so if we draw some conclusions about what the Enuma Elish, this ancient Babylonian account of creation, suggests, it says, look, there are multiple gods. We see Apsu, and we see Tiamat, and we see Marduk, and we see Kingu, and a whole host of other gods. And these other gods are jealous. They're angry with one another. They're violent, and they're waging war against each other. We see the world as being a place of violence and of chaos. And so if they look at the world and they see violence around them, they say, well, why is that here? Well, it's here because the very nature of the world is to be violent. The world is created out of violence. Marduk, who created the world, created through violence. And then humans were created to serve Marduk, and not just to love him with a service, but it kind of this forced, slavish service to the gods. Humans then were to serve the gods to make the gods happy. So this is the picture we get of how the ancient Babylonians saw creation. It came from multiple gods. The world was violent and chaotic, and humans were meant to serve the gods. And it's in that context that Genesis 1 is written. See, the ancient Israelites would have known the Babylonian creation account, and we could look at other creation accounts as well. The Egyptian creation account, very similar to the Enuma Elish, in the fact that it comes out of multiple gods and not a peaceful creation, but a violent creation, a chaotic creation. And so because the ancient Israelites knew this is the world in which they wrote, this is what we come across in the scriptures. Genesis 1, verse 1 says this: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Notice there's no mention of multiple gods. There are no waging wars between one god and the other god. One god is not jealous of another. It's simply In the beginning, God. The Hebrew word for this is Elohim. In the beginning was one God, Elohim. And this one God created the heavens and the earth, everything. That's Genesis 1, verse 1. And it goes right into this. Now, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. Genesis 1, verse 2 paints a pretty bleak picture of creation. It's formless. It's empty. The Hebrew word here is tohu vabohu. It's a fantastic little phrase, tohu vabohu. It means chaos, destruction, desolation, disorder. The picture we get is that there's this massive sea of water and it's chaotic. And for the ancient Israelites, water is a picture of chaos. Water was a place of destruction. And so over the surface of the deep, darkness was over the surface of the deep, there's waters, it's chaos, it's destruction, it's disorder. But the story doesn't stop there. God speaks into it. Now the earth was formless and empty. There's chaos all around. The darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. The ruach in Hebrew, the breath, the very wind of God was blowing over the waters. There's something about the Spirit of God that's going to resist this force of chaos. It's going to resist the tohu vabohu. It's going to push back the darkness. It's going to blow with its breath against the forces of evil and darkness. The Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, getting ready to push back this chaos, the tohu vabohu. And then as we go through Genesis 1, if we were to read through Genesis 1, we'd see this pattern. And the pattern goes something like this. And God said, "Let there be light." And it was so. And God saw that it was good. Over and over again, that pattern is recurring. God said, "Let there be," and it was so. Notice there's no violence. There's no warring. There's no bloodshed. God simply speaks creation into being. He speaks it into being out of love and out of generosity, out of care for other. God didn't have to create, but he chose to create. And the way that God creates, according to Genesis 1, if you read it, is that he separates things. He separates the waters above from the waters below. And he separates the waters from one side and the waters from the other side, and he creates dry ground. It's interesting to me that he says he creates by separating. And as he creates, separating the waters, he's putting the waters, and the waters again is a symbol of chaos, of destruction, of disorder. He's moving that out of the way. And in its place, God creates life and goodness where chaos once was. Out of chaos, God creates order. I think Genesis 1, that's a fundamental teaching of Genesis 1. That one of the key things that Genesis 1 is teaching us is that there's one God. There are no other gods. God doesn't need to wage war over others to show his victory and power. It's simply there's only one God. And this one God is a God of peace and of love and of creativity. He doesn't create out of violence. He creates simply by speaking. And when he creates, he takes things that are chaotic and disorderly, and that might have pain and destruction in them, and God creates something beautiful. God creates order. This is true of the universe, but I think this is also true of our lives. If we simply turn on the news, we see headlines of great pain, of great sorrow, that are deeply affecting people. This is just simply today's headlines. Today, the funeral for George Floyd, unjustly killed at the hands of a white police officer. Another headline: the Burundi president dies suddenly at 55. There's an oil spill in Russia. COVID continues to spread. So many things. So much pain, so much disorder, so much destruction. Is there any hope? Genesis 1, I think, tells us right in the very first chapter of the Bible that there is hope. That God is a God who creates beauty and goodness out of chaos, out of destruction. The Spirit of God hovers over the waters, and over the waters he begins to separate and put the things of disorder and destruction and chaos in their proper place. And in its place, he begins to create beautiful things. He begins to create goodness and peace and justice and shalom. This is not just true on the national level, but this is true in our own lives. I suppose we could think about our own lives and think about the ways in which God creates goodness out of our own brokenness, the pain that we have in our own story. God is going to take that and to put it in its proper place and create beauty out of the brokenness. This is the way that God works. God takes things that are broken, things that are disorderly, and he puts it in its place, and he begins to create goodness out of it. I think we see that already in Genesis chapter 1. That God is a good God. God is a God of love. God is a God of creativity who takes the chaos of the world and creates order. And so if we are made in the image of God, this too is what we are called to do. We find places of pain. We find places of brokenness. We find places where there's deep hurt. And we are called to go there and, like God, because we image God, we mirror God, we seek to bring order where there's disorder. We seek to bring beauty where there's brokenness. We seek to bring healing where there's hurt. Genesis 1 tells us in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.